Ulavinaka, welcome to this Blue Pacific Talanoa series, webinars for the people, our first for this year, 2021, and of course on that very important theme, Pacific history, global futures, securing a nuclear-free Blue Pacific. My name is Samisoni Pareti. I'm the publisher for the Islands Business Magazine, and we will be your moderator for today's webinar. Thank you for joining us. I particularly welcome the peoples and leaders of the Blue Pacific continent, the members of the 18 countries of the Pacific Islands Forum. I also want to say a special welcome to all our friends joining us from the friendly capitals beyond our shores. A special welcome to our representatives of the Forum Dialogue partners who are joining us as well today. And of course, a special mbula, warm welcome to our 4 panelists who are with us already this morning. High Commissioner Josaia, Ambassador Bonzanini, Ms. Ariana Shibon, and the Deputy Secretary General of Pacific Islands Forum, Dr. Philemon Manoni. Before we start, I thought we'll just quickly go through what's in store for us as our program for the webinar today. After short opening remarks by the chair of the Pacific Islands Forum and the Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum, then we'll have our panelists speak for about 3 minutes just to give an overview of their take on the theme of today's webinar, which is securing a nuclear-free Pacific, Blue Pacific. After their presentation, about 3 minutes each, then we'll have the question and answer session as we usually do. And you're most welcome to send through your questions to any member of the panel on the Q&A option that you have on your platform. Then after the Q&A session, continue for about 30 minutes, we should be reaching the 1 hour time duration that we have set aside for this webinar. I'll just do a quick summary before we will then conclude with a poem by the well-known Pacific Island poet, Kathy Jatnil Kijna. So without further ado, I will now welcome the opening remarks of the chairman of the Pacific Islands Forum, Prime Minister Vorenga Bainimarama of Fiji.
This Sunday, our Forum family joins the global community to commemorate the International Day Against Nuclear Tests, a day devoted to honoring all victims and survivors of nuclear tests, to raising public awareness about the fatal consequences of nuclear explosions, and to remembering why nuclear testing must come to a permanent end. This day was declared by the UN General Assembly in 2009, following a resolution initiated by Kazakhstan to mark the closure of the Semipalatinsk nuclear test site on 29 August 1991. This was an unprecedented act to demonstrate to the world that it does not need powerful nuclear tests and weapons, and led the way for the closure of other testing sites, including in Mururoa and Kiribati. Although the Semipalatinsk nuclear test site closed 30 years ago, the region's residents are still affected by more than 450 nuclear tests that were conducted there by the Soviet Union. This is a story all too familiar for our Blue Pacific continent, which was the theater for some of the most powerful nuclear tests ever conducted in world history, and what we consider atrocities perpetrated on our people without our consent. We endured 5 decades from 1946 to 1996 of more than 300 nuclear tests at atmospheric surface and underground levels. These were conducted on Bikini Atoll and Eniwetok Atoll in the Marshall Islands, in the Montebello Islands in Australia, near Maldon Island and Kiritimati Islands in Kiribati, on Johnston Atoll and on Mururoa and Whangataufa atolls in French Polynesia. The impacts have been nothing short of devastating, from the local, regional and global fallout to the residual contamination and radioactivity in our ocean and lagoons. From the permanent relocation of resident populations in the Marshall Islands to the serious and lasting impacts on the health, environment and human rights of our affected communities. The darkest of these days was the 1st of March, 1954, when the Pacific witnessed the largest ever nuclear test explosion, the Castle Bravo test in the Marshall Islands. In the hours after the test, life-threatening radiation doses were received by people in nearby atolls. The nuclear testing legacy has left a gaping wound in our otherwise peaceful and bountiful Blue Pacific. A just resolution of our outstanding issues remains evasive to this date, and we call on those responsible to take meaningful steps to address these lingering issues. There is no question that the unresolved nuclear testing legacy issues in the Pacific continue to pose a clear and present danger to the livelihoods of the peoples of the Blue Pacific. As leaders of the Pacific Islands Forum, we have been steadfast in calling for action on long-standing nuclear test legacy issues in our Blue Pacific and advocating for effective remedial action to mitigate against the threat to the health, to the security and prospects of our Blue Pacific as a consequence of the nuclear testing programs. Currently, we are engaging with the government of Japan and international partners to ensure the prevention of any further harm to our region from Japan plans to discharge ALPS treated water into the Pacific Ocean as part of efforts to decommission the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. As we commemorate this important day, and indeed our 50th Forum anniversary this year, it would be remiss of us not to pay tribute to the foresight of our forebears in this regard, for their strong vision of a Blue Pacific free of nuclear weapons, a vision emphatically embedded in the language of our South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone Treaty, more commonly known as the Treaty of Rarotonga. The treaty successfully led to the permanent cessation of nuclear testing in our region in 1996. Through a product of its time, the Treaty of Rarotonga is one of the very first and most significant achievements as a Forum family. A legally binding instrument with a regional and global reach that continues to serve and inspire our region and protect our people and our prospects to this day, and no doubt into the future. The treaty is a powerful testament to what we can achieve through regionalism under the framework of international law and in support of the rules-based international order to which we all subscribe. It is a product of strong regional consensus and a collective determination to expunge the nuclear threat from our Blue Pacific region. Just 7 months ago, the states parties to the Treaty of Rarotonga met for the first time. Their ministerial statement reinforced the principles underpinning our nuclear-free zone, including the freedom to live in peace and independence, and the enjoyment of peaceful social and economic development free from the threat of environmental pollution. As we look towards 2050 and our shared future as a united Blue Pacific, the threat of nuclear proliferation remains a reality. We only know too well the damage it has done to our environment, to our health and well-being. As a Forum family, we must never be complacent. We must always call for peaceful and just action. In this regard, I reiterate the call by Forum leaders in 2019 for remaining states to sign and ratify the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. I'm also heartened by the entry into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons on 22nd January 2021. I call on every peace-loving member of the global community of nations yet to sign the treaty to consider doing so, thus contributing meaningfully to ending the proliferation of nuclear weapons and bolstering world peace. As a United Forum family, we honor the victims and survivors of nuclear tests, and we celebrate our proud Blue Pacific success and activism against nuclear tests and nuclear threats. As we envision the safe and peaceful world we want to leave for our children, a nuclear-free Blue Pacific must remain our legacy, and the total elimination of nuclear weapons must be the highest disarmament priority in the world. I thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Prime Minister of Fiji, Bainimarama, the chair of the Pacific Islands Forum. Now, ladies and gentlemen, friends, let's welcome the new Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum, Mr. Henry Puna, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, moderator. The Honourable Josaia Bainimarama, Prime Minister of Fiji and Chair of the Pacific Islands Forum. Our distinguished panelists this morning, His Excellency Ali'o Ainga Feturi Elisaya, High Commissioner of Samoa to Fiji. His Excellency Flavio Roberto Bonzanini, Secretary General of the Agency for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in Latin America and the Caribbean. Ms. Ariana Tibon, Director Public Awareness and Education of the Marshallese Nuclear Commission. Dr. Philemon Manuni, Deputy Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum. And all our Pacific people and friends across our Blue Pacific and beyond, tuning in this morning. Bula vinaka, kia orana, and warm Pacific greetings to you all. I am honored to welcome you all to this important Pacific event to commemorate International Day Against Nuclear Tests. A special welcome also to our distinguished panelists. At the outset, I join the Prime Minister of Fiji and Chair of the Pacific Islands Forum, the Honourable Bainimarama, in paying respect to all the victims and survivors of nuclear tests, as well as to their families. I also recall and pay tribute to the strong leadership of all our forum leaders, past and present, who in unity and solidarity with those affected have vowed never to allow these atrocities to befall our beloved Blue Pacific home again. Nuclear testing is a legacy that no people, nation, or region should ever have to endure. Indeed, nuclear testing was a key political driver for the establishment of our Pacific Islands Forum 50 years ago. As alluded to by the forum chair, our leaders have made every effort possible to overcome this plight. Key to our collective efforts is our Treaty of Rarotonga, which distinctly ensures that we are a nuclear-free zone and not just a nuclear weapon-free zone. My home country of Cook Islands was not a testing site, but our people bore witness to what has been described as an awesome glow in the sky. Of course, the said glow was a mystery for our people of the North, who swooped to collect, share, and feast on the fish washing up along the shorelines. In 1965, our Premier Albert Henry said, "We are the closest to the French islands where the tests are to take place. And if anyone has the right to speak out, then surely it is the Cook Islanders." That right was in fact a responsibility, our shared responsibility, and one that we continue to carry today. This responsibility is exacerbated by the continuing presence and advancement of nuclear weapons and the susceptibility of our Pacific Ocean to illegal nuclear activities, including transportation of highly radioactive material and the dumping of nuclear waste. Unfortunately, the nuclear threat is mutating and is now more complex than ever, including the threat of the militarization of space. In the current context of climate change, There is a growing trend towards nuclear energy. But friends, nuclear energy poses major risks and consequences in and of itself, including disaster-related accidents. And as we face these ongoing threats, we must take heart from our victories and draw on some key lessons from our nuclear legacy, such as follows. First, to enable lasting change, we must do it together. Second, we all have a role to play at all levels in our societies and through all peaceful means possible. And thirdly, we must claim and own our place in the world to strategically influence and shape global change. These are lessons which have carried us through the past 50 years and which remains very relevant to the threats we face today. As we look ahead, we must remain united and firm in our resolve to continue our advocacy. As Secretary General, as depository of the Treaty of Rarotonga, and as Pacific Ocean Commissioner, I am fully committed to doing my part in our continued quest towards a nuclear-free Pacific and indeed a nuclear-free world. I thank you.
Secretary General Henry Puna, Secretary General Pacific Islands Forum. Now, with the welcoming remarks completed, we will now go on to the second part of our discussion of our webinar, which is, of course, the panel discussion. Just a quick introduction of our panelists, as you've also heard from Secretary General Puna. We have High Commissioner Josaia, who's Samoa's High Commissioner to Fiji. Of course, he was posted to Suva from his posting in New York, United States, where he was Samoa's permanent representative to the United Nations, as well as to the ambassador to the United States of America and High Commissioner to Canada. His posting to Suva was last year after February 2020. We also have Ambassador Onzanini. He's the Secretary General of the Agency for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in Latin America and the Caribbean. He's a lawyer by profession, and he has served as a diplomat for his country, Brazil, before becoming the Secretary General of the Agency for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in Latin America and the Caribbean. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for joining us today. We also welcome Ariana Sibon. She's the Director of Public Awareness and Education at the Marshall Islands National Nuclear Commission. She's also, as we've heard, Chair of the Pacific Island Forum mentioned about the Bravo shot in the Marshall Islands. Ariana is a direct descendant of survivors of that catastrophic Bravo shot. And of course, last but not least, we have Dr. Philemon Manoni, the Deputy Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum, and he's also served as Attorney General of Marshall Islands, as well as legal advisor to many key regional institutions. Thank you very much. And now we'll, for the first 3 minutes, we are going to invite members of the panel to have their opening remarks. And we'll start with High Commissioner Josaia, who will have picked the theme to speak on, the theme of things have come full circle for the Pacific Islander. High Commissioner Josaia, NAC.
Well, Honourable Prime Minister of the Republic of Fiji, Honourable Secretary General of the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, Mr. Moderator, distinguished panelists, friends of the Pacific, ladies and gentlemen. Every journey has 4 distinct features: a point of reference, a starting point, signposts, and a final destination. My point of reference for the Rarotonga Treaty was the establishment of the Pacific Islands Forum as a separate entity from the South Pacific Commission 50 years ago. It was significant because it provided space for Pacific leaders to discuss peace and security and political issues freely within which they couldn't do within SPC, because the metropolitan powers were present and some of the issues were sensitive and directly affect some of them. So issues like independence, decolonization, and nuclear testing became the Pacific Forum's DNA. I believe that without the enabling environment that PIF offered, I doubt if the Rarotonga Treaty will ever become a reality, let alone discussed and considered. So that is the regional point of reference. My own starting line was Tuvalu. I was a member of Samoa's delegation to the Tuvalu Forum meeting in August 1984, where the decision was taken to appoint a working group of officials to prepare a draft of a nuclear-free zone treaty for leaders' consideration at the next meeting. We had a small staff in our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but I was told to represent Samoa on the drafting committee. I was not a nuclear scientist or an international lawyer, but Samoa was determined to have a seat at the drafting table to render legitimacy, inclusivity, and ownership of our draft report. And the rest is history. The draft text of the proposed treaty was endorsed by our leaders at their forum meeting at Rarotonga and opened for signature on August 1985. It came into force in record time a year later. So why was this? I think it's common knowledge that some Pacific Island countries were sites of nuclear testing, and the scars and fear and mistrust as a consequence of the experience gave our region a shared point of reference that has shaped our perspective on nuclear disarmament. And this helped unite us in our efforts to establish the Rarotonga Treaty. So Tuvalu was my starting point. The first signpost was in 2005 at the Conference of States, Parties, and Signatories to treaties that establish nuclear weapons-free zones at Tlatelolco. In Mexico, the namesake of the first nuclear-free zone treaty for Latin America and the Caribbean region in 1967. Samoa was chair of the Pacific Islands Forum Group in New York, and we were invited to attend. New Zealand and Fiji also participated. Importantly, the different Pacific statements and interventions ensured that the spirit of the Rarotonga Treaty was alive, relevant, and its presence felt on the global stage outside of its Pacific birthplace. The next signpost was in New York in 2015 during the review conference on the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We delivered a statement referencing the Rarotonga Treaty's contribution as the second such nuclear-free zone treaty, stressing that the only guarantee against the use of nuclear weapons was through the total elimination of all nuclear weapons. The other stop was in 2017 when we were Pacific Chair again in New York, and this was the year when the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was open for signature. Samoa and 5 other Rarotonga Treaty members signed the treaty, and Samoa ratified it a year later. And when the treaty entered into force in January this year, 8 Pacific member states were already states parties to the treaty. And the rest, and the last stop, whereas but Tuvalu, when it hosted the 50th Forum meeting in 2019, where leaders called for the operationalization of the provisions of the Rarotonga Treaty. It was at the Tuvalu Forum in 1984 when the decision was taken to start the drafting of a South Pacific Nuclear-Free Zone Treaty, and it was at Tuvalu again that the call for the states parties to operationalize the treaty was made. Things have indeed come full circle. Symbolically for me, things came full circle when I was back in Samoa. Last year on December 15th, I was privileged to join virtually from Apia, the first ever meeting of the states parties to the Rarotonga Treaty, also marking the 35th anniversary of its adoption. And the final destination? Well, I guess the finishing line is still out of sight. Some powerful and influential people keep changing it. Why? We don't need to look far. The Free Rarotonga's own protocols have not been ratified by the United States, despite some positive indications made earlier. Secondly, and for us in the Pacific, is there appetite to regionalize the Rarotonga Treaty to reflect the full forum membership? And finally, Japan's announcement to discharge ALP as-treated water into the Pacific Ocean has rung the alarm bells again. We need independent and verifiable scientific assessment that this is indeed safe. We have a right to be reassured that this is indeed the case. Nothing more, nothing less. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you, High Commissioner Josaia. Now ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Ambassador Bonzanini, the Secretary General of the Agency for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in Latin America and the Caribbean, and he'll be talking on the theme, the significance of nuclear-free zones. Ambassador Bonzanini, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. And thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this panel. So following with the recommendation of our moderator, I'll try to be very brief. As the Secretary General of OPANAL, created by the Treaty of Tlatelolco, which re-established the first zone of its kind on 14th February 1967, I would say that the importance of nuclear weapons-free zones resides in the fact that it was and certainly is still an innovative approach to achieving common security region by region. Moreover, these zones set important milestones for the nuclear non-proliferation regime, like the first time a group of states decided to join such initiative and agreed to pursue general and complete disarmament. 2, the first time an explicit reference of a prohibition of nuclear weapons was included in a multilateral treaty. 3, the first time a verification mechanism was created, and certainly not less important, 4th, the first time the inalienable right of all nations to use nuclear energy to meet their development needs was also included. Nowadays, the 5 nuclear weapons-free zones and 1 state self-proclaimed free of these weapons, Mongolia, which represent 115 countries, share the goal of the total elimination of these weapons of mass destruction. However, more collaboration and information exchange among the zones is needed. This is why I welcome initiatives like this panel. Thank you, Mr. Moderator, and I look forward to our dialogue session. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Bonzanini. Our third member of the panel is Ms. Ariana Chibon from the Marshall Islands. She will be talking to us on educating on nuclear impacts and outstanding issues in the Pacific. Thank you, Ariana.
Yeah, go ahead. Thank you so much, Samisoni. Thank you all for the invitation for us to come and speak today. I would like to, first of all, introduce myself briefly. My name is Ariana Tiwan, and yes, I am a direct descendant of survivors of the catastrophic Bravo shot, and I work for the Republic of the Marshall Islands National Nuclear Commission, which was enacted in 2017. And the Nuclear Commission, or NNC as we call it, was established to coordinate the government's need to address ongoing unresolved issues and challenges arising from the US nuclear testing program that took place in the Marshall Islands between 1946 and 1958. And as one of their main priorities was education. And I tell you this because although the testing began in 1946, it was not until 2019, I repeat, 2019, that the nuclear legacy was finally integrated into school systems. And so growing up, I had no idea that my own family were test subjects in the Project 4.1, which was a top secret medical study. And the test subjects for that were human beings. Those human beings were my family. And that's how I became so dedicated to this work and realized that education is such an important role because many generations have missed out on this history, our piece of history. The generation before me, my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation, my grandparents at the time were still toddlers during the time the testing happened, but they did not get a chance to learn about this in school. Nobody learned about Project 4.1. We didn't learn about the burn files. We didn't learn about jellyfish babies. We didn't even learn about Runut Dome. I had no idea there was Runut Dome. I even had no idea there was the Enowetak cleanup veterans who helped to create that dome to try to contain all the radioactive elements in Enowetak. I even had no idea there was 2 atolls that they did testing in. Growing up, I thought it was just Bikini, and I thought it was just 1 bomb. I didn't know it was 67 bombs. And so there's high numbers of cancer cases. My family has suffered many losses due to cancer. And a lot of it is because of the nuclear legacy and the impacts that it has, not only on the environment, but on the people. And as the Education and Public Awareness Director, I'm working hard to make sure that younger generations who are the future leaders of nuclear-free Blue Pacific will have this knowledge. And so as you understand, there is like 2 generational gaps missing out on this knowledge and the nuclear legacy. The National Nuclear Commission made sure it was a priority for it to be included in school curriculums. And since 2019, students in the Marshall Islands are finally having a chance to learn about this piece of our history. And my humble request to all, especially my dearest fellow youth, all over the Pacific and all over the world, is just to keep learning, keep on learning. I sometimes feel like, you know, we're just at the tip of the iceberg and there's so many information that has not been declassified for us. But that's why we gotta keep on learning and stay persistent, keep going forward, continue with your path firmly in your course of action in spite of difficulty or opposition. When it comes to nuclear legacy and the nuclear testing, I personally feel like there's always opposition and it's hard to move forward. But we have each other, the Blue Pacific, we have each other. We're supposed to keep encouraging each other and keep learning this knowledge. And once we have that knowledge, we can take that knowledge and run. We can run with it because then the narrative will be ours and we'll be able to share this history with others. At this moment, all the information or most of the information that we have comes from US documented reports or US studies. We don't have our own studies, and we are the future leaders. We are the future scientists, the future lawyers, the future doctors. We have the capabilities to learn, and then to step up in our roles as the future leaders, to then come forward and say, this is a piece of our history, and we must do what is right and just as the Prime Minister stated, we should never be complacent. I am sorry I have exceeded my time limit. Thank you all once again.
Thank you, Ariana. Very enlightening and interesting. And we're looking forward to more discussion in the question and answer session on your particular experience. Now we will welcome Dr. Philemon Manoni, Deputy Secretary General, Pacific Islands Forum, and of course he's talking on the theme, operationalizing the Treaty of Rarotonga to secure a nuclear-free Blue Pacific. Dr. Manoni.
Thank you. Thank you, moderator, and thank you to all of those who've spoken before me. And also thanks to Ariana, and you can tell why this passion in her statement, Kumala Ariana. So I've been asked to say a few things on the operationalization of the treaty. And I think a lot of details and history on the adoption as well as the entry into force of the treaty have been captured in the comments by our previous speakers. Acknowledgement to the statements both by the Prime Minister of Fiji as the forum chair, as well as to the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat Secretary General, Mr. Henry Puna, on their comments in commemoration of the upcoming Day Against Nuclear Tests. It is a fitting juncture that we have come around to this day, as Ambassador Fetuli had also noted in his remarks of his personal experience, that this has come around from the initial initiative of the treaty to actually talking about implementation, operationalization of the treaty again in Tuvalu in 2019. But, you know, the treaty is an example of what we as a region can do if we put our heads together, collectively, commitment to this. You know, we as a region paid a very high price for what others called, or for the so-called peace of mankind, without our consent and without any contribution from us, but we paid the price. So to the wisdom and the foresight of our forebearers came about the establishment of the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone Treaty, most commonly known as the Treaty of Rarotonga, as it was adopted there in '85. The treaty establishes, coordinates a zone, a region that encompasses all states, parties, territories, as well as those of those powers that have signed on and ratified the protocols. And yes, there are some of our members that are still considering the treaty. The treaty remains open for members who have not to consider and to actually take the necessary steps toward eventual ratification. The treaty is important because it reinforces at the regional level legally binding commitments that we as states parties to the NPT, and many of us are already parties to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of '68, and to commit to prohibitions in our own region or within the zone to ban the testing of nuclear weapons, dumping of nuclear waste, the stationing of material within each of our territories. And so, and furthermore, the obligation to keep our Blue Pacific region free of environmental pollution. And some of our previous speakers have spoken about the current discussions and the current work that is being undertaken in response to the government of Japan's decision to discharge ALPS treated water into the Pacific Ocean. while we understand that that it is their decision to do so, to introduce that into their territorial waters, we are worried about the transboundary impacts of this action. As we noted earlier in 2011 and 12, the map of the currents and the discharge and the migration of isotopes as a result of the Fukushima breakdown, which traveled far across the Pacific, as far as the west coast of the United States and Canada. So while countries do have the right to do that, they don't have the freedom, to introduce items that would cause transboundary harmful effects across the Pacific. And as you know, the successful campaign during the nuclear tests in the Pacific by our countries, which ended up in the international court, also spoke to that. But for the topic today, the idea is what can we do under the treaty mechanisms to operationalize these and its objectives. As we noted, the leaders in 2019 decided, that we should be doing a little bit more with our treaty. There are mechanisms under the treaty, given the mutation in the challenge or the danger posed by nuclear weapons. But not only in terms of government proliferation, but of course, there is a real danger with the entry into the picture of non-state actors in possession of nuclear material. The total elimination of nuclear weapons, nuclear material, I think is the goal of all of us for peaceful international community to coexist into the future. So opportunity to implement decisions to get the mechanisms under the treaty working again. We have what we call a consultative committee established under the treaty to look at these technical issues. We also have provisions under the treaty that serve as control mechanisms to ensure that parties to the treaty are living within their obligations, so living up to their obligations under the treaty. There is also the obligation, the opportunity to participate in interzonal collaboration. And I must say today that I am very pleased and honored to be speaking on this panel with Ambassador Bonzanini, Secretary General for the Latin American Nuclear Free Zone. And I can assure you that our two zones will continue to collaborate, and that we'll be willing to participate and support in your activities as well. But as noted by the Secretary General, these zones are tools in the toolbox of the effort against the proliferation of nuclear weapons. If these zones combine of about 150 some odd countries that denounce nuclear weapons, has a meaningful impact on the state of nuclear weaponry and also on its proliferation. So, and we can address the questions such as the ongoing nuclear testing legacies, which is a long-standing matter that the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat has undertaken in support of the Marshall Islands and other countries who've suffered from the testing. And then we can utilize our mechanisms also to, to have a look at the issue that we are looking at currently on the ALPS water that Japan has decided to discharge into the ocean. But with these brief remarks, Mr. Moderator, willing to listen to some questions and then to contribute further to the discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deputy Secretary General, Dr. Philemon Manoni. As we had alluded to, now we'll go into our question and answer session. There's a few questions that have come through. For those of you who have joined us, thank you for your patience. And you are most welcome to also contribute by posting questions through the Q&A option that you have on your Zoom platform. And also just a reminder from the admins of this webinar is that because of the time factor, we are going to conclude now. We're going to add 15 more minutes to the discussion. So we are going to finish off at 11:15 this morning. So the first question is directed to Deputy Secretary General, Dr. Manoni. Regarding the case of the Marshall Islands versus nuclear possessing states in the International Court of Justice, was there a joint position from the Pacific Islands Forum member states? Second question, what were the main lessons learned from this process for the region? And third, will a Pacific Island member state continue with a similar international judicial process towards disarmament?
Thank you, Moderator. I take it that the question is with regards to the cases that the RMI filed at the International Court of Justice. In that regard, that was an RMI action alone. It was RMI action alone, and the RMI in that case took a number of nuclear powers to the International Court of Justice. It would have been an interesting outcome had the ICJ entertained the case. In any case, the case was what we call summarily dismissed because the ICJ, in short, in brief, decided that it did not have jurisdiction to hear the case for a number of reasons. That they did not find that there was an existing dispute in the beginning to start with. And so quite conveniently, and that's my criticism of the ICJ system, I think my personal views, but quite conveniently dismiss the action on the basis that it did not have procedurally, it did not have jurisdiction to entertain the case. But in that case, the decision was, I think, 8-4 and 7 against. So it almost got to the substantive part of the hearing of the dispute, but unfortunately, it fell over by 1 or 2 votes in that regard. So it was an RMI decision only to go to the ICJ at the time, and not the regional position. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Secretary General. The next question, maybe this will go to High Commissioner Josaia and perhaps Deputy Secretary General, if you would like to add afterwards. How can the Pacific address the health and environmental legacies of nuclear testing when nuclear weapon powers like France and the United States are members of key regional agencies like the SPC and SPREP?
Well, I think for us, we always wanted to make sure that we're in the same room with some of our partners so that we can afford to say upfront. I think it's a question of the right hand not knowing what the left hand is doing. Sometimes it depends on the issues, and then we talk to the same partners as if these are not on the table. I think we need to be as frank as possible, and I think the time is right now. The fact that we are trying to operationalize the Rarotonga Treaty, I think this would be one of our goals. I also make reference earlier in terms of the United States not ratifying the free protocols. I think this can also place our partners so that we know exactly who are the genuine ones. But I think too often we go to our partners with just one issue, forgetting that that is only one aspect of our relationship. We should look at the total relationship. And if there are issues that really concern us, then of course we should take this up with our partners. And we may not be able to implement the solutions immediately, but at least the fact that we are able to bring it to their attention, and hopefully there will be some solutions, gradual as they may be. So I think basically what I'm saying is, they are our partners. They have been with us over many years, and I think we owe it to them also to share with them what our true feelings are, rather than just talking amongst ourselves behind their back. I think it's important to bring it to their attention, so that they realize too that we are genuine in terms of our concerns. So these are important issues, and we don't have to go and look and find spaces to meet up with them. They are members of these same organizations. And it's not just the SPC and SPRED. There are also other organizations, even in the context of the UN and outside of our Pacific region. So I think the challenge is, let's be upfront. Let's share with them, and then we'll take it from there. Thank you.
Deputy Secretary General, would you like to add, or that's sufficient?
Yeah, thank you. Just very briefly, I concur with the comments by Ambassador, but yes, certainly they could do more to support the Pacific in terms of the remaining outstanding legacies. I understand there are some bilaterals at the test site countries. The US and the RMI continue to go with it. The Pacific Island Forum has consistently supported the cause for the RMI in terms of the US involvement. But of course, we are not looking at this as strictly some legal obligation, but there's got to be some thinking about a moral thing that that after all this devastation, that there's got to be some work to try and mitigate the issues, or to try to resolve the issues. But you can't just run away from the impact of your actions in the region. Thanks.
Thank you. I think the next question is for you, Ariana. Using your experience as an educator on the nuclear issue, how can we reach the grassroots level in educating these island nations who are suffering about nuclear weapons impacts? What can they do? How can we reach the grassroots level in education?
Thank you, Mr. Samisoni. I think a way to reach the grassroots level is to, well, let me just start with, I feel like in order to really get the students to understand this history is to provide visuals. It's to bring in a group of students to act it out, to do a skit. And then once they really see this, because I feel like nowadays visuals is more like appealing to the younger generations. Once they really get to see this bit of history, and if they watch videos of long time ago, although a lot of them are kind of filtered, once they get to really fully understand the extent and the trauma that's associated with this, they would be able to, ignite or spark a small fire within themselves. And then they could reach out to their leaders and, petition, this is what happened in the Marshall Islands, or even for the Marshallese youth, we not having any of this knowledge, we're not able to voice ourselves. But once we are given the education and the knowledge about the nuclear testing and the impacts of, especially the impacts of nuclear testing, then the youth are able to act. And by acting, that means they would be petitioning to leaders. The social media is there. We have a lot of Pacific youth social media influencers. And once they are able to post content, facts about the nuclear testing throughout the Pacific and not just the Marshall Islands, they would be getting audiences, international audiences, and drawing attention to this legacy. I feel like that's what they could do, especially during these times. They could be really capitalizing on all their social media accounts and putting out all of this content and information about nuclear testing and about the trauma associated with the impacts of nuclear legacy.
Thank you, Ariana. Thank you for that. Next question is for Ambassador Bonzanini. You must be hearing how we in the Pacific are talking about operationalizing our Treaty of Rarotonga. We're also talking about education from Ariana, and also the concerns and fears we have about the administration of the treaty, of keeping the Pacific nuclear free. What are some of the lessons learned that we in the Pacific can learn from the Treaty of Tlatelolco that you were the first one to introduce in Latin America and the Caribbean in 1967? Maybe one or two key lessons that you may want to share for the benefit of the Pacific, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I think that one of the most important lessons is to have a building blocks strategy. When I was in New York last year for a meeting, I was approached by some members of the UN from the Middle East. And they were asking me this question: how did you do to reach such a big, with 33 member states belonging to our nuclear free weapon zones? And then I told them that we had a lot of patience to accept and to negotiate with so many Latin American, Caribbean states. And so, although the Treaty of Tlatelolco is from 1967, it took us 35 years to have all the countries of the region as member states of our nuclear weapon free zones. The last country that adhered to our treaty was Cuba, only in 2002. So I would say that this is a very important thing to do, to negotiate as much as you can to have all this membership. And also in our negotiations among our 33 member states regarding declarations, communiques, and other statements from common status from our organization. We also try to be flexible. And as you know, with 33 member states and with a very unstable region like ours, with different political orientations, what we see is that many countries do abdicate from some of their positions, so we can have a common ground and to keep on working together. And so we haven't had any major dispute or any major misunderstanding among our 33 member states. And so I think this is also very important eventually for the other nuclear weapon-free zones. This flexibility to negotiate, to find common grounds, not only internally, but also externally. Like we are negotiating right now with AFCON, the African nuclear weapons-free zone. And so it took us almost a year negotiating a cooperation agreement. And now we have concluded our negotiations, and we'll take this result to our general conference at the end of September. And then we'll be able, maybe in October or November, to sign this very important technical agreement of cooperation with AFCON. So it's not good to give lessons to anybody, but I see that some of these issues that we have treated along those more than 50 years of existence of our free zone could be eventually be used by other free zones, and even for the creation of new nuclear weapon free zones, like the Middle East, for example. I don't know if I have answered the question, but those are remarks that I think that could be important. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you very much. Our next question asks, how do the panelists view the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which entered into force in January this year? The treaty notes the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons use and recognizes nuclear testing victims and survivors, the disproportionate impact of these weapons on indigenous people, and the harm in particular to women and girls from ionizing radiation. Do you see it as a useful contribution to growing international consensus on the need to eliminate these weapons? Ariana, want to go first?
Thank you, Moderator Samisoni. I will just briefly comment that the Marshall Islands, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, is still studying the treaty provisions, particularly the ones related to victims remediation. We are also concerned that no nuclear states are involved in the treaty, and we continue to work through our other avenues to advance discussions with key partners and ensure our outstanding nuclear testing issues are being addressed by the appropriate parties. That is all. Thank you.
Deputy Secretary General Dr. Manoni or High Commissioner Josaia want to add?
High Commissioner can take the floor first, and then.
Well, I was going to say exactly what Ariana has just said. I think it's a welcoming development in that the treaty has come into force. But if you look at it, none of the so-called known nuclear weapon states have ratified the treaty. So I think that is a concern. But hopefully, as more countries start to ratify it, I think there will be a sway of opinion on the other side. But I think realistically, also we know that at the end of the day, these are national priorities to some of these countries, and no amount of persuasion from all of us will be able to force them to ratify some, which is unfortunate. But it shouldn't stop us. We knew, even through the Rarotonga Treaty, we knew that it would be difficult, but we still tried, and that's why I was suggesting maybe this year or next year, we should talk to the Americans. If you're serious about your concerns about what's happening in our region in the Pacific Ocean, are you prepared to take the first step and ratify the protocols in our Rarotonga Treaty? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, High Commissioner. Deputy Secretary General.
Thank you, moderator, and thank you for the previous comments. And yes, it is, I think, a signal or a sign of the growing global consensus against the proliferation of nuclear weaponry. It is, zero tolerance under the treaty. If you look at the prohibitions under Article 1 of the treaty, it is quite clear and endorses, supports what we have already under our Rarotonga Treaty. But we can, have a look at the treaty obligations under that one, as well as what we have under the Rarotonga Treaty. But I think there are concerns around what was raised earlier about the non-participation of nuclear weapons, nuclear states under the treaty. As you know, the intention was that over time that the treaty could eventually attract parties to ratify nuclear weapon states to ratify the treaty and to give it some more force and effect. It's a challenge, but it is good to see that those of us in the Pacific has chosen to ratify the treaty. Those of us carefully studying the treaty, and just to note that the entry into force in such a short period of time really demonstrates global consensus on our desire collectively to get rid of weapons of mass destruction. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Deputy Secretary General. Ambassador Bonsanini, is there anything you want to add to the remarks that have been said, sir?
Well, I would like to recall that before the treaty that entered into force on January 22nd of this year, there was no international agreement, no international treaty that prohibited the nuclear weapons as such. There were treaties prohibiting chemical weapons, biological weapons, and now this is a very important humanitarian initiative. And I think like in our region, most of our member states of OPANAL, of the Treaty of Tlatelolco, have already ratified the treaty. And so I think in other regions, this will go on. And maybe in a few years, those nuclear powers will be very isolated, there will be a very small minority, and there will be each time more and more pressure from the society, the civil organizations, even from from companies to pressing those nuclear states to change their positions. So it's really, I think it's a landmark for all of us that are worried about the consequences, effects of those nuclear testing, bombs, and all of that. So I think it's really a very important landmark, and we should work together and to foster this humanitarian feeling that's behind this treaty. Well, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Maybe this, because of the time, this will be our final question. And the question asks, what can be done under the Treaty of Rarotonga to mitigate the environmental legacy of past nuclear testing, such as radiated infrastructure and the oil leaking from the shipwrecks in Bikini Atoll? Under the Treaty of Rarotonga, what can be done? Secretary General, Deputy Secretary General, Dr. Manoni, maybe Ariana would like to add.
Thank you. Thank you, moderators. The Treaty of Rarotonga sets in place sort of a framework. Number one, to control, to make sure no activities associated with nuclear weapons testing, stationing, dumping, and so forth in the within the zone. In terms of the type of support to for those who've suffered under the nuclear testing programs, I think that's, I said earlier that those who are responsible should do a little bit more in terms of recognizing the impacts, the environmental impacts, the health impacts in the region generally. In response to the leaders' tasking in 2019, we have been, or there has been some thinking around, whether we could perhaps do a stocktake review of the current state of the environment in terms of what the impacts continue to be and what dangers in terms of nuclear waste material is doing to the environment and is impacting on the health of citizens. I know that in the case of the RMI, there is bilateral arrangements that is ongoing in terms of the health and of course the environment as well, but not enough, as admitted by the RMI. A lot more could be done, and so at the political level, the forum has consistently conveyed to the United States government to support the activities or the efforts of the RMI to address the issues related to that. In terms of support under the treaty, I think issues such as this, understanding the state of the technical issues related to the state of the environment, studies, health of the people, and I think some of those activities undertaken through other crop agencies, some health initiatives by SPC to the northern countries as part of that support. But in general, I think the issue is that a lot more should be done, and that the recognition by those responsible that these issues remain unresolved. In terms of working together with all countries in the region, RMI is still studying the, the Rarotonga Treaty in terms of action towards ratification. But like all other countries in the region, those who have not ratified, with the permission of the chair, are invited to participate as observers in the work of member state parties under the treaty. But we hope that RMI and 2 other countries will consider the treaty a little bit more closer, and hopefully we'll get that ratified soon. Mr. Moderator, some brief comments in response to your question. Thank you.
Thank you. As it always happens, Ariana, you want to add anything there?
Sure, como tada, moderator Samisoni. So the Marshall Islands is not a party to the treaty, as Dr. Manoni said, and for us, it is not a tool for addressing our nuclear legacy issues. However, on the issue of ongoing environmental contamination, we need the Nuclear Claims Tribunal awards to be paid, and that requires United States support. Just a note, the tribunal awards included funding for environmental remediation. And for this, we need independent scientists to help give us confidence in the data that we do have. And we have international support for repatriating our communities back to their ancestral lands by working with us to find ways to remediate our contaminated islands and to make them safe for our communities again. Kumol.
Thank you. As it always happens, towards the end of the webinar, then we have a tsunami of questions. So I've been granted time to ask 2 more final questions. This is one from Meroni. It asks, last month, the people of Maui Nui continued their long-standing demand for nuclear justice against the nuclear tests by France over their islands, as President Macron visited the region. What kinds of regional leadership is needed to hold powers like France to account, seek justice, and nuclear-free and independent Pacific? Do the panelists have a view on the role of France today and the region, given their legacy? I think Deputy Secretary General, Dr. Manoni, will take the first bite.
Thank you. And it is significant, not only because of its presence in the region, but for the nuclear tests that occurred in the Muro and those atolls undertaken by France. It has it has territories in the Pacific, so it must have an interest in the Pacific that is free of nuclear contamination and so forth. But that is the legacy that that you have, underground tubes of nuclear waste material under the atolls. What that I think the challenge is the obligation is twofold. I don't have a detailed knowledge of what bilateral activities between the that France and President Macron have undertaken. But I know that he has given an undertaken, acknowledged the impacts in his visit to French Polynesia recently. And I think getting these powers to recognize and admit to these impacts goes a long way as a first step to do that. Because without that recognition, it could be difficult for them to actually come around and do that. It is important to do that. We know that they are participating in the crop membership in the region and providing support in other areas in the region through crop intervention in the needs and issues of the Pacific as well. So that is a welcome aspect of the presence in the region. But as I said, a little bit more, particularly specifically with the testing program legacy issues, that not enough has been done. So, leadership means doing a lot more where there is a need to. In terms of, I think it just needs very frank, communications to these nuclear powers that, first of all, that the Pacific, if you want to dump something, you come and dump it in Pacific. I think that should not be the, and I think the leaders and at the PALM, as well as in their statements, have made that known, indicated that this is not a dumping ground, and we're not going to sit back based on our experience in the past, that we're not going to sit back and do nothing, but we're going to hold you accountable for what you plan to do in the region. So I think those are comments for our sort of thinking about the subject matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Secretary General. Commissioner Josaia, if you want to make a remark, you're most welcome. Otherwise, I'll go to the next final question.
No, I'm just going, excuse me, I'm just going to say that I think the most powerful people to make an impact are the people on the ground in the respective territories, or because at the end of the day, they are also voters, and they have people representing them, whether it's the legislative assembly or parliament. Sometimes I think I made this reference before. We need not to be selective in what we discuss with our partners. And I think at the political level, we also have, I'm not sure now whether it's triennial or biannual Oceania Pacific meeting between our leaders and the French president and his representatives. So there are avenues for us to try and raise all these issues so that it becomes at least noticed or at least noted. But I think at the end of the day too, the people on the ground are also the one who can be very powerful. There is also the role for the youth and for everybody to be aware of this, because these are issues that are rarely discussed in the open. And I think having this kind of conversation hopefully will allow people to be open-minded, and more importantly, to speak about it, but not to point fingers, but to look for solutions, because these things have happened in the past, and some of the people have not benefited from any assistance to their individual cases. Thank you.
Thank you. With the time really going against us, I have to ask this as the final question. And we've heard about the need for the United States and also France now to play their part and role in keeping the Pacific nuclear free. This question asks, apart from the states that continue to claim some unique right to threaten us all with nuclear weapons, there are also states like my own, Australia, that claim protection from nuclear weapons owned by others and provide assistance for their possible use. Many citizen organizations in Australia are grateful for Pacific leadership on the crucial issue of addressing climate change and eliminating nuclear weapons. We are grateful for any encouragement you can give to Australia to get on the right side of history for both of these existential threats. Thank you. That's not a question, it's basically a commendation. Deputy Secretary General, is there anything you'd like to add there?
Thank you. No, just to note that Australia is a party to the Rarotonga Treaty. I have no detailed information as to what the questionnaire has about the activities that have been raised, but just to note that Australia is party to the Treaty of Rarotonga. Thanks.
Maybe for our last remarks, Ambassador Bozzanini, you've been listening to the questions coming through, and other members of the panel take those questions. Again, I'm going back to the experience of Treaty of Tlatelolco. How does the treaty handle those kind of issues? Do you have maybe similar issues like we're having with Japan on its plans to dump treated nuclear waste into the Pacific Ocean, or the legacies of American testing in Marshall Islands, as well as the French in French Polynesia? Maybe is there something that we can learn from the Caribbean and the Latin America experience?
Well, thank you, Mr. Moderator. Well, we have a very hard matter dealing with some four nuclear weapon states that when they became members of our two protocols to the Treaty of Tlatelolco, they made some declarations that are really reservations. They didn't accept some of the clauses of our treaty, and even regarding the zone of application of the Treaty of Tlatelolco, which has limits with the limits of the Treaty of Rarotonga and the Pacific. And so we are negotiating, trying to negotiate with four nuclear powers, United States, the Russian Federation, and France, and United Kingdom, for them to not maintain to those reservations. And it has been a very difficult negotiation, because in some ways, those declarations they have made when they become members of those protocols give them the right, in their own view, to not abide by the clauses of the Treaty of Tlatelolco. And this way, I think there would be a similarity with the issues of the Blue Pacific zone. But I think that this is only the main point of disagreement that we have with those four nuclear powers. And so we are discussing this question internally, and in our general conference at the end of September, we're trying to approve a resolution among our 33 member states, and then we'll start to negotiate again with those four nuclear powers, and to assert our position, and to try for them to not maintain those reservations they've made. But it will be a very difficult negotiation, we think. That's the parallel I could make with this, with the Pacific, Blue Pacific nuclear weapon-free zone. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you so much. Good to hear of the experience that you are experiencing in the Latin America and Caribbean region. Now, I'm afraid we have to conclude, and we will now invite renowned Pacific poet, Kathy Jatnil-Lijna, for her presentation. Thank you.
I'm coming to meet you. I'm coming to see you. What stories will I find? Will I find an island or a tomb? To get to this tomb, take a canoe. Take a canoe through miles of scattered sun. Swallow endless, swirling sea. Gulp down radioactive lagoon. Do not bring flowers or speeches. There will be no white stones to scatter along this grave. There will be no songs to sing. How shall we remember you? You were a whole island once. You were breadfruit trees, heavy with green globes of fruit, whispering promises of massive canoes. Crabs dusted with white sand scuttled through pandanus roots. Beneath looming coconut trees, beds of watermelons slept still, swollen with juice. And you were protected by powerful Iroij chiefs birthed from women who could swim pregnant for miles beneath a full moon. Then you became testing ground. 9 nuclear weapons consumed you one by one, engulfed in an inferno of blazing heat. You became crater, an empty belly. Plutonium ground into a concrete slurry filled your hollow caverns. You became tomb. You became concrete shell. You became solidified history. Immovable, unforgettable. You were a whole island once. Who remembers you beyond your death? Who would have us forget that you were once green globes of fruit, pandanus roots, and whispers of canoes? Who knows the stories of the life you led before? Here is a story of a turtle goddess. She gifted one of her sons, Ledao, a piece of her shell anointed with power, a leathery green fragment, hollow as a piece of bark. It gave Ledao the power to transform into anything, into houses and trees, the shapes of other men, even kindling for the first fire. He almost burned us alive. I am looking for more stories. I look and I look. There must be more to this than incinerated trees, a cracked dome, a rising sea, a leaking nuclear waste with no fence. There must be more to this than a concrete shell that houses death. Here's a story of another shell, anointed with power. Ledao used it to transform into kindling for the first fire. He gave this fire to a small boy. The boy almost burned his entire village to the ground. Licks of fire leapt from skin and bones, from strands of coconut leaves. While the boy cried, Ledao laughed and laughed. This is a story of a people on fire. We pretend it is not burning all of us. Here is a story of the ways we've been tricked, the lies we've been fed. It's not poisonous anymore. Your illnesses are normal. You're fine. You're fine. My belly is a crater empty of stories and answers. Only questions. Hard as concrete. Who gave them this power? Who anointed them with the power to burn?
powerful indeed, anointed by Kathy Jatnin Kitchener. Well, that's it for our webinar today. Again, I would like to acknowledge and thank High Commissioner Josaia, High Commissioner of Samoa to Fiji, Ambassador Bozanini. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us today. Ms. Ariana Chivon, thank you, Director, for joining us from Majuron, Marshall Islands, and of course, Deputy Secretary General Dr. Philemon Manoni. Thank you for your participation in the panel discussion today, and we thank all our members of the Pacific Blue Continent who join us today for our first series of a Pacific Blue Continent webinar, which focused on Pacific history, global future, securing a nuclear-free Blue Pacific. Thank you so much, and we'll hear from you all again in our next webinar in 2 weeks' time. Inaka, thank you. Misamode.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Naka.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Flavio.
Okay, thank you so much.